Here I am coming with the video lesson on the first chapter in your biology textbook that deals with sensations and responses. We all know that there are different senses that can evoke responses in organisms. For example, when we see an object such as an apple, as you see here, there are different sensations associated with it. We see the object, we recognize its color, shape, and size. Then we get the taste sensation when we eat it. We can smell the apple. All these are different sensations that can evoke a response in us. So, here we go with our lesson sensations and responses. We have seen that senses can evoke responses in us. These senses, which evoke responses in organisms, are called stimuli. Stimuli can be external or internal. External stimuli are those that we get from the outside environment. For example, light, sound, taste, touch, all these are external stimuli. They are perceived from the external environment. But there are certain stimuli such as hunger and thirst which are not received from the external environment but they are arising within our body. They are called internal stimuli. Now let us see how the body receives stimuli. Here you can see the picture of tongue, which is the sense organ of taste. On the surface of tongue, you can see small bud-like structures which are called taste buds. These taste buds have specialized cells that help in the perception of different tastes. Similarly, in the eye, we have specialized cells that can receive visual stimuli. So, we have specialized cells in the sense organs to receive stimuli and they are called receptors. When these receptors receive stimuli, they generate certain signals which are called impulses. These impulses are the messages which are then sent to the brain. It is the brain that analyzes these impulses and plan and execute a response. Brain is part of the nervous system. So we can say that nervous system controls and coordinates these actions. We have seen that nervous system controls and coordinates the body actions. What is the nervous system made up of? Nervous system is made up of cells called neurons. Neurons are the basic structural and functional units of the nervous system. Here you see the picture of a neuron. Like any other cell, the neuron is also having a cell membrane, cytoplasm, and nucleus. What are the specialized features of neurons? The neuron is having a cell body where the nucleus and most of the cytoplasm are present. Arising from the cell body are numerous processes. The short processes arising from the cell body are called dendrons. And these dendrons branch to form dendrites. There is one long process emerging from the cell body which is called the axon. The axon is longer than the dendrons. At the other end, the axon branches to form axonites. The axonites end in terminal bulb-like structures called synaptic nerves. The elongated axon is covered by cells called Schwann cells, which form a sheath-like covering around the axon. The neurons are specialized for the transmission of impulses, and transmission of impulses occur in only one direction, that is, from the dendrites to the dendrons, cell body, axon, axonites, and synaptic nerve. The Schwann cell, which is covering the axon, repeatedly encircles the axon, forming a sheath called myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is formed of a membrane which contains lipid. The axons group together form bundles which are the nerves. In the nerves, myelin sheath is formed of Schwann cells. But in the brain and spinal cord, the myelin sheath around the axons are formed of specialized cells called oligodendrocytes. As I said, most of the neurons have myelin sheath around the axons. They are called myelinated neurons. But there are neurons which do not have the myelin sheath around the axon. They are called non-myelinated neurons. The myelinated neurons appear white in color because of the myelin sheath, and the part of the brain and spinal cord where myelinated neurons are abundantly present will be white in color. It is called the white matter. The part of the brain and spinal cord where non myelinated neurons are present will appear gray in color, and it is called the gray matter. Now, coming to the functions of myelin sheath. Myelin sheath provides nutrients and oxygen to the axon. You know that neurons are concerned with the transmission of nerve impulses and they are part of the brain and spinal cord. Brain is always doing its function of controlling and coordinating the body actions. It requires a lot of energy, and for that a continuous supply of nutrients and oxygen is very much essential. Myelin sheath is concerned with providing nutrients and oxygen to the axon. That is the first function of myelin sheath. Myelin sheath can accelerate the propagation of impulses because in myelinated neurons, the impulses can jump from one node to the next so that the speed of propagation is accelerated several times as compared to the non myelinated neurons. Here in this picture, you can see the difference in the speed of propagation of nerve impulse in myelinated neurons and non-myelinated neurons. In the myelinated neurons, the speed of propagation of impulse is much faster than in non-myelinated neurons. Then the next function of myelin sheath is it acts as an electrical insulator preventing the loss of ions. Since the myelin sheath is forming a covering around the axon, it is preventing the loss of ions from this axon. That is why it is acting like an electrical insulator. Myelin sheath also protects the axon from external shocks. These are the functions of myelin sheath. Now we are moving on to the very important section, that is generation and transmission of nerve impulses. As I said, like any other cell, neuron is also having a cell membrane. There is differential distribution of ions on either side of the plasma membrane. Because of this differential distribution of ions, the outer surface of the plasma membrane is positively charged and the inner surface is negatively charged in a resting neuron. What happens when a neuron is stimulated? When a neuron is stimulated, there occurs a change in the distribution of ions at the point of stimulation. Look at this picture. The point of stimulation is shown in pink color. At this point, there is a reversal in the distribution of ions. The outside of the membrane at this point is negative and the inside of the membrane is positive. This reversal of distribution of ions results in the generation of nerve impulse. And this nerve impulse that is generated stimulates the adjacent part of the neuron cell membrane. Hence, the reversal of distribution of ions occurs there also. This process is repeated and the impulse gets transmitted along the neuron cell membrane as electrical charges. What happens when a nerve impulse reaches the axon terminal? When a nerve impulse reaches the terminal of an axon, it has to be transmitted to the next neuron. Let us see how this happens. At the axon terminal, the neuron meets with another neuron, a muscle cell or a glandular cell. And the junction between two neurons or a neuron and a muscle cell or a neuron and a glandular cell is called a synapse. As I said, synapse is the junction between two neurons. The neuron before the synapse is called the presynaptic neuron and the neuron that comes after the synapse is called the postsynaptic neuron. The synapse is formed between the synaptic knob of presynaptic neuron and dendrite of postsynaptic neuron. At the synaptic knob, there are membrane bound vesicles which are called synaptic vesicles. And these synaptic vesicles contain certain substances for the transmission of nerve impulses. They are called neurotransmitters. The gap between the presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron is called synaptic cleft. When an impulse reaches the axon terminal, the synaptic vesicles fuse with the plasma membrane of the presynaptic neuron and neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft. So, what are neurotransmitters? Neurotransmitters are the substances which are released into the synaptic cleft during a synaptic transmission of nerve impulse, and these neurotransmitters are responsible for the transmission of nerve impulse from one neuron to another neuron. Examples of neurotransmitters are acetylcholine and dopamine. These neurotransmitters bind with the plasma membrane of the postsynaptic neuron and stimulate the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron. This stimulation causes the generation of new nerve impulses, which are then transmitted along the plasma membrane of the postsynaptic neuron to the next synapse. Now, coming to the types of neurons. There are two types of neurons based on the type of impulses that they carry. They are sensory neurons and motor neurons. Sensory neurons carry sensory impulses from the sense organs to the brain and spinal cord. It is because of these sensory neurons that we are able to perceive different senses. Next comes the motor neuron. Motor neurons carry motor impulses from the brain and spinal cord to various parts of the body. You know that when we perceive senses, we are able to produce certain responses based on these senses. And these responses can involve motor actions, that is, movement of body parts. And these motor actions are executed because of the motor impulses which are carried by the motor neurons from the brain and spinal cord to various parts of the body. As I told earlier, the axons of neurons, they bundle together to form nerves, and these nerves are covered by a connective tissue. Now, coming to the types of nerves. Based on the types of neurons present, the nerves are of three different types. They are sensory nerves, motor nerves, and mixed nerves. Sensory nerves are formed of sensory neurons and they carry impulses from various parts of the body to the brain and spinal cord. Motor nerves are formed of motor neurons and they carry impulses from the brain and spinal cord to various parts of the body for the execution of motor actions. Mixed nerves are formed of both sensory neurons and motor neurons. Since they contain both sensory neurons and motor neurons, they carry impulses from the different parts of the body to the brain and spinal cord and also back from the brain and spinal cord to different parts of the body. We are now moving on to the next section, that is nervous system. Nervous system consists of central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is formed of brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system is formed of cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Cranial nerves are the nerves which are emerging from the brain, and spinal nerves are the nerves which are emerging from the spinal cord. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. First, let us see about the brain. The brain is protected inside a skeletal structure which is called the skull. Inside the skull, the brain is protected by a covering which is made up of three membranes which are called the meninges. There are certain cavities inside the brain which are called ventricles. These ventricles and the inner membranes of meninges are filled with a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is formed from the blood and it is reabsorbed into the blood so that its volume is always maintained constant. The function of cerebrospinal fluid is to provide nutrients and oxygen to the brain tissues, to regulate pressure inside the brain, and to protect the brain from injuries. The outside view of brain shows that it is formed of these three parts: the cerebrum, cerebellum, and brain stem or medulla oblongata. The sectional view of brain shows that it is comprised of cerebrum, cerebellum, medulla oblongata or brain stem, thalamus, and hypothalamus. First, let us see about cerebrum. When compared with other parts, cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It has numerous fissures and folds. The outer layer of the cerebrum is made up of non-myelinated neurons and it appears grey in color. This layer of the cerebrum, which is formed of grey matter, is called cerebral cortex. The inner part of the cerebrum is made up of myelinated neurons forming white matter. This inner part is called cerebral medulla. The cerebrum is divided into two cerebral hemispheres, that is, the right and left cerebral hemispheres. Cerebrum is concerned with all the intellectual functions like thought, intelligence, memory, and imagination. It also controls voluntary movements. Voluntary movements are the movements of body parts according to our will, that is, conscious movements of our hand, legs, etc. These are controlled by cerebrum. Next is cerebellum. It is the second largest part of the brain that is seen behind the cerebrum as two flaps. Like in the cerebrum, cerebellum is also having fissures and grooves. The function of cerebellum is to coordinate muscular activities and maintain equilibrium of the body. When we are moving our body parts, the balance and equilibrium of the body is maintained and we are protected from falling down because of the functioning of cerebellum. The next part of the brain is medulla oblongata or brain stem. It is a rod-shaped structure that is located below the cerebrum and near the cerebellum. It is concerned with the control of involuntary actions, that is, the actions which are not under the control of our will. The muscular contractions of the heart muscle during heartbeat and the movement of respiratory muscles while breathing are involuntary actions. Such involuntary actions are controlled by the medulla oblongata. Next is thalamus. It is situated below the cerebral cortex in the interior of the brain. It acts as a relay station of impulses to and from the cerebrum. That is, thalamus passes information or impulses to the cerebrum from other parts of the brain and from the cerebrum to other parts of the brain. Thalamus analyzes the impulses coming to the brain from various parts of the body and pass only the important ones to the cerebrum. For example, when we are sleeping, we are able to have a sound sleep because of thalamus. During sleep, the thalamus will pass the impulses to the cerebrum only if they are significant enough, and only in that case our sleep will be broken and we will wake up from sleep. Otherwise, we will have a sound sleep and wake up only after a full sleep. Next is hypothalamus. As the name indicates, it is located just below the thalamus. It plays a major role in homeostasis. What is homeostasis? Homeostasis is the maintenance of stable and balanced physiological condition within our body. It involves regulation of body temperature, salt and water balance of the body, regulation of hormone secretion, etc. All these are essential for maintaining homeostasis and it is done by the hypothalamus. Next, let us see about spinal cord, which is also the part of central nervous system. Spinal cord is present as an elongated structure following the brain stem. It is protected inside the vertebral column. Vertebral column is the skeletal structure that is present at the backside of our body. Like in the case of brain, the spinal cord is also protected by a covering which is called meninges. The spinal cord is also having a canal-like cavity which is called the central canal. It is also filled with the cerebrospinal fluid as in the case of brain ventricles. But in the case of the distribution of white matter and grey matter, it is exactly opposite to that we have found in the brain. In the spinal cord, the white matter is seen outside and the grey matter is seen inside. Here you can see the sectional view of spinal cord. The grey matter is present inside and the white matter is present outside. As I told earlier, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Each spinal nerve has a dorsal root and a ventral root. The dorsal root and ventral root join together to form the spinal nerve. The dorsal root carries sensory impulses from different parts of the body to the spinal cord, and ventral root carries motor impulses from the spinal cord to different parts of the body. Now let us see about the functions of spinal cord. The impulses from different parts of the body are transmitted to the brain, and the impulses from the brain are carried to different parts of the body through the spinal cord. Spinal cord also coordinates the repeated movements of the body during walking, running, etc. Now look at this picture. An insect is flying towards the eye of this girl. She is blinking her eyes and turning away her head. This boy accidentally stepped on a thorny stem and he is suddenly retracting his leg. Such accidental and involuntary responses towards stimuli are called reflex actions. They do not happen consciously. Our body has the ability to make such involuntary responses or reflex actions to protect ourselves from dangers. The pathway of impulses in a reflex action is called a reflex arc. Look at this picture here. A person is coming in contact with flame which is very hot. It can burn his finger. When the person comes in contact with the flame, which is the stimulus, immediately sensory receptors in the skin will perceive the hot burning stimulus and impulses are transmitted suddenly through the sensory nerves to the spinal cord. Inside the spinal cord, there is an interneuron. The interneuron will generate motor impulses and it is transmitted through the motor neuron to the muscles of the hand. Immediately, muscle action occurs in the hand and the person will retract his hand from the hot flame. All these steps take place in a fraction of a second and the body is protected from getting burnt. Let us see the reflex arc once again. First, there is a stimulus. The stimulus will be perceived by the sensory receptors which generate sensory impulses. The sensory impulses are carried by the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. Inside the spinal cord, there is an interneuron which generates motor impulses which are then transmitted through the motor neuron to the muscles to bring about muscle action. This is the pathway of impulses during a reflex action which is called reflex arc. There are two types of reflexes, cerebral reflexes and spinal reflexes. Cerebral reflexes are under the control of cerebrum and spinal reflexes are under the control of spinal cord. Now look at this picture again. This girl is turning away her head from the insect. This action is taking place in the head region and it is controlled by the brain. Hence it is the cerebral reflex. This boy is retracting his leg from the sharp object. It is taking place in the part of the body below the head and it is controlled by the spinal cord. Hence it is the spinal reflex. Let us have a comparison of cerebral reflex and spinal reflex. Cerebral reflex is controlled by brain whereas spinal reflex is controlled by spinal cord. Cerebral reflex takes place in the head region whereas spinal reflex takes place in the rest of the body. Cerebral reflex is brought about by cranial nerves whereas spinal reflex is brought about by spinal nerves. Now let us study about the autonomous nervous system. Autonomous nervous system controls the activities that take place beyond our conscious level. It is part of the peripheral nervous system. The autonomous nervous system is comprised of two parts, the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system are antagonistic. That means their functions are exactly opposite to each other. Now let us study about the functions of sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. As I told, the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system are antagonistic, which means that their functions are exactly opposite to each other. Sympathetic nervous system is activated when a person is under stress or when a person has to face emergency situations. Parasympathetic nervous system controls the bodily functions when a person is at rest. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, the pupil in the eye dilates, and parasympathetic nervous system causes the pupil in the eye to contract. Sympathetic nervous system causes a decrease in the production of saliva, whereas parasympathetic nervous system increases the production of saliva. Sympathetic nervous system causes the trachea to expand so that more volume of air will be inhaled into the lungs. Parasympathetic nervous system causes the trachea to contract so that the normal inhalation will take place. Sympathetic nervous system causes an increase in the rate of heartbeat, whereas parasympathetic nervous system causes the heartbeat to become normal. Sympathetic nervous system causes the gastric activities to slow down, whereas parasympathetic nervous system causes the gastric activities to become normal. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, there is an increase in the conversion of glycogen to glucose, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system causes the conversion of glucose to glycogen. Glycogen is a reserve food material which is stored in the liver. Sympathetic nervous system causes the peristalsis in the intestine to slow down, whereas parasympathetic nervous system causes the intestinal peristalsis to become normal. Sympathetic nervous system causes an increase in the production of hormones, whereas parasympathetic nervous system causes the hormone production to decrease. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, urinary bladder capacity increases and the urinary sphincter will remain tightly closed. Whereas in the case of parasympathetic nervous system, the urinary bladder contracts and the urinary sphincter relaxes and opens. These are the functions of sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. Now let us see about the disorders of the nervous system. First is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is caused by the accumulation of an insoluble protein in the neural tissues of the brain. Because of the accumulation of this insoluble protein, the neurons will get degenerated. And the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease includes loss of memory, inability to recognize friends and relatives, inability to do routine activities. Next is the Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is caused by the destruction of specialized ganglions in the brain. There is also a reduction in the production of neurotransmitter dopamine, which is very essential for the normal activity of the brain. The symptoms of Parkinson's disease include loss of body balance, irregular movement of muscles, shivering of the body, and profuse salivation. Next disorder of the nervous system is epilepsy. There occurs a change in brain activity. Epilepsy is caused by a continuous and irregular flow of electric charges in the brain. The symptoms of epilepsy includes continuous muscular contraction, frothy discharge from the mouth, clenching of the teeth, and finally the patient falls unconscious. These are some of the disorders of the nervous system. With that, we finish our first lesson, that is sensations and responses. Thank you.